Thank you very much for introducing me, and thank you all for taking the time to come along. Today I want to talk about terrorist drones and future war, but seeing as this is a DS Ideas lunchtime talk, what I thought I'd do is focus on one particular idea which is at the core of my research and at the core of my forthcoming book on drone warfare. I've got a clicker, haven't I? High tech. There we go. Okay. And the idea that I want to focus on is that the West is entering a new epoch of warfare. One that sees a transition from bloodless wars, that is low casualty, cost-free, risk-free conflict, defined by the use of high-tech precision missiles and drones to keep troops off the ground, and is moving through to what I call blooded warfare. So that's a return of visceral, costly, casualty-heavy battle for Western nations, including European nations, including Denmark, and the United States as well. Now, my argument is based on extensive interviews with special operations forces, both here in Europe and in the United States, but also the broader European military and the US military as well. And I've conducted these over the last 12 months whilst being here at DS and during my visiting fellowship at Yale in the US. And this is going to continue over the next 6 months or so when I go to Niger, Nigeria and Burkina Faso to do some interviews with troops on the ground there as well. And you'll see why those particular places are important and indicative of this shift in Western warfare as we go through the talk. Now, why do I believe this change is taking place? Well, my argument is simple, but hopefully important. Drones and precision technologies, once the panacea to the costs and risks of Western warfare, have now proliferated globally to the enemies of the West. And by this, I mean terroristic non-state actors, such as ISIS, but also other state actors, perhaps not in line with Western nations, are supplying their own high-tech drone technologies, which they manufacture, such as Iran, for example, to those groups that are against our forces. So let's say Houthi rebels, for example, over in Yemen. But before we go into a bit more detail about this change in the nature of warfare, or indeed the character of warfare, what I'd like to do is to explore the history of these precision technologies and to look back and see what it was that they were originally intended to achieve. What were the ambitions and desires behind the manufacture of these technologies in the first place? Because by understanding the history of these technologies and the American search, or broader Western search, for a bloodless, cost-free war, we can start to see how warfare is evolving and has evolved over recent years towards this more bloodied warfare. Now, let's start by looking at the Obama era, the first drone president, as he was called. And it's no coincidence at all that it was during the first year of the Obama administration that drones really started to take off, pun intended. And the reason for this is because Obama was elected on the platform and indeed the promise to the American people that he would withdraw them from the cost-heavy wars in Iraq. Of course, that was the bad war, the one that the United States was going to pull out of pretty much immediately, and then also help them win the good war in Afghanistan, the legitimate war, but in time withdraw American troops from the ground of that conflict as well. And the reason for this is because the IED, the improvised explosive device, the terrorist weapon of choice, had proliferated across the region during that period. And as a result, 60% of American fatalities between 2009 and 2011 were as a result of the IED. Infantrymen, a number who I've interviewed, could no longer trust the ground that they were walking on. They were moving at a snail's pace, perhaps as much as 100 metres per hour. So the demand of the American people was to withdraw these troops from these conflicts. But this leaves Obama with a dilemma. How do you continue to fight the global war on terror but without deploying your best, your brightest, your youngest, sacrificing blood and treasure on the ground. Well, this is where the drone starts to come in. Now, Obama starts by justifying his use of drones on moral and ethical grounds. He says that they are part of a just war, a war waged proportionately. And he says that they are precise, and simply put, they save lives. The idea is that with pinpoint precision drone strikes, you can kill the bad guys and save the good. Civilians won't be caught up in the crossfire. Of course, this is now 10 years later, and we know that all of that was a myth. Obama admitted to around 116 civilian casualties as a result of drone and precision missile strikes, but now we're looking closer at the idea of around 7,000 civilians that were killed by these strikes. So what was the real reason behind the use of these technologies? Well, the truth actually probably comes from this last comment made by one of Obama's spokespeople towards the middle of his second term. And this was that drones remove risk from war, something which I thought was a rather ambitious aim at the time, but perhaps not incorrect, because what they do is they remove risk from war for the United States. These drones, which are sent thousands of miles across the other side of the world, they allow for the US not to have to deploy large amounts of troops on the ground. Remember, the drone pilot and the remote sensor operator are in a room thousands of miles back in Creech Air Force Base in the Nevada desert, for example. They sit there, they operate the drones, they go home to their families without having to ever have the risks and costs of war put upon them. So this is really the main reason why the US harnessed these drone technologies and deployed them, and have deployed them as the spearhead of American counter-terror strategy for the last 10 years. But this aim in itself, this investment in technology as a quick fix and panacea to the costs and risks and bloodiness of war, is nothing new. And in fact, it goes back around 100 years or so. Now, bear with me. To understand the American obsession with drones and drone technologies, we need to go back to around 1916-17 and the American reactions to the First World War. The last major conflict the US had fought in before this happened about a generation beforehand, and this even longer, and this was the American Civil War. Now, in the intervening years, the US had passed legislation such as the 1823 Monroe Doctrine and the 1904 Roosevelt Corollary, which stated that the US would keep itself out of such bloody conflicts, especially if the European brutal old world of Europe tried to pull the US in. So it would remain isolated, and instead it would be involved in small policing interventions and bandit wars. So we're talking about Nicaragua in 1909, or Cuba in 1905, or Haiti in 1915. These are wars in America's backyard. They are wars fought over the rights for bananas and wars fought over the rights for sugar. American economic interest in its broader area. However, by 1916-17, this all started to change as President Woodrow Wilson drew the US back into the brutal wars of the old world. Now, in this conflict, and this is something that's often overlooked, the US had up to 364,000 casualties. And as the troops started to come home, maimed and injured, or in coffins, there were protests in the streets in the United States. Protests against Wilson, but also protests that the US should ever be involved in this sort of entrenched, bloody battles like the Somme that defined the First World War. And instead, what the American people wanted was for the US never to be involved in such wars ever again. And it's at this point, a few quite quick and clever American air power strategists who have been trying to prove that air power, which was a fledgling technology at this point, was the future of American warfare. And what they did was they tied their technology to public opinion. And people here, like Colonel Edgar S. Gorell, who was one of the first chiefs of the Air Service, argued that if the US invested in high-tech air power, then it would never have to commit such high levels of troops on the ground ever again. Instead, he came up with something called industrial web theory, which was more colloquially known as precision bombing doctrine. And this term precision in war can go all the way back until 1916-17. And what he argued was that if you fly over the top of the enemy into their cities and you bomb specific key industrial targets such as their munitions dumps, their oil refineries, the places where they make tyres or put together their tanks, then what you can do is you can weaken the teeth of your enemy on the battlefield. That is their war-fighting capacity. And if you do that, then when you meet them on the battlefield, you won't have to have entrenched, embattled warfare because the enemy won't be able to put up a fight. Instead, you can just go straight through them without having the costs that were associated to the First World War. And this is all part of an over, not through ethos. Pinpoint precision, again, another term that comes from that point. We associate it with Obama or modern warfare, but it goes all the way to that point, is enshrined within this early air power doctrine. And then what they do is they start to invest in technologies that can make this work. And it might be surprising to learn that one of the first unmanned aerial systems dates from 1916-17. And it's just there in the top left corner. And this is known as the Kettering bug. And it was created by someone called H.H. Arnold alongside an engineer called Donald Douglas. And what they did was they took the normal design for a biplane from the period, they fixed it to rails, they put in a motor and an early gyroscope to keep it level, then they set the engine to rotate a certain amount of revolutions, and then they set it off as the crow would fly into the air. Now, the aim was that this would fly over a preset amount of distance. Once the amount of revolutions had turned in the motor, it would shut off, and then the wings would drop off. And I think Arnold said at the time that it would swoop down like an eagle and take its prey. And its prey here would be the industrial sites in an enemy city. Now, in reality, there was no swooping of an eagle. In fact, it flied around quite a lot and never hit its target. And in fact, it could only go around 100 miles or so. So, in fact, for the US, it was pretty useless in terms of being a weapon. But the ambition was there. The ambition to remove the human from the loop of war, to strike the enemy at distance without ever having to sacrifice American life. And I argue this is an ambition that has stayed at the heart of American warfare, or perhaps become renewed at the heart of American warfare, usually after cost-heavy conflicts, for the last 100 years or so. And it may seem odd that I'm now jumping to the Gulf War in 1991, but I promise you, it will all tie together. So, those of you who don't know the background to the Gulf War, it began on August 2nd, 1990, when Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein ordered the invasion of his oil-rich neighbour, Kuwait. Now, Iraq was in financial turmoil after it fought a costly and embittered war against Iran for around 8 years. So it was in desperate need of some financial injection. And a quick fix for this was to invade Kuwait. It would allow Iraq to harness its oil and would fix its money issues. And Saddam believed the US wouldn't intervene with this. They'd allow Saddam to do this because of the costs they'd suffered in Vietnam. The US was a society that would not risk being caught in another Vietnam War. Now, the reaction was perhaps not what Saddam expected. George H.W. Bush, in the first war of the post-Cold War era, saw the importance of maintaining the status quo and not allowing another nation state to breach the sovereignty of another nation state. So he amasses a coalition of 39 nations and 900,000 plus troops and moves them onto the border between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Bear in mind that on the other side, you have around 1 million of Saddam's troops as well. So in 1991, you have almost 2 million troops amassed on the battlefield. this was a risky commitment. The LA Times at the time said that the US should expect to lose at least 20,000 personnel. Saddam had the world's fourth largest army, and Saddam promised that America would not be a society that could suffer 10,000 dead in one battle. And according to Saddam, if they did engage with his troops, the Iraq War, the first Iraq War, would be the mother of all battles. However, there was one thing that Saddam had not considered, and this was the American investment that had taken place since the Vietnam War in high-tech precision intercontinental ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and drone technologies as well. These were in part to help with the US to avoid going into a nuclear war. They were part of what the American strategist Albert Wallstratter called a discriminate deterrence, where the US wouldn't have to resort to nuclear options. But in the post-Cold War era, they became perfect for the US to go against Saddam, but without having to sacrifice their troops on the ground. Again, much like the ambitions of the Kettering bug early on. And the reason why we jumped to this particular example is because it was a Lieutenant General David Deptula who came up with the air power plan for this particular war, called Global Reach, Global Power. And when I interviewed him, he said to me that he had been reading a lot of America's early air power strategist work before he made this plan. He had been reading Gorrell and other people like Mitchell and Arnold, and he saw a way with the investment in new technologies, such as the cruise missiles, high-tech microcomputing, satellite transmission, live video relay, that could allow the US to achieve these long-held ambitions in war, for this bloodless war. And so it was within this war that cruise missiles and precision and drones were used hand in hand. Drones flew off the US Iowa and off the USS Wisconsin as well. And the effect was the destruction of Saddam's forces, his air force, which had to flee to Iran, and also its infrastructure and communications. Very quickly at the beginning of the battle, due to the pinpoint precision missiles, Saddam was left both deaf and blind, unable to communicate with his troops or direct them on the ground, and the US could just pick off their targets. As a result, the Gulf War became known as the 100-hour war. After 6 weeks of relentless bombing, Saddam's troops were decimated. In fact, the drones would fly over the top. They would send video images back or record images and then fly back and they'd be analysed. And then the cruise missiles would be sent in to hit those targets that the drones had picked out. So precise and effective were these technologies that when a drone would fly over the top of Saddam's troops, they would try and surrender to them. And as Deptula said to me, this was the first time in the history of warfare that a human had tried to surrender to a robot. Now, this example highlights to us just how distant the American forces were from engaging with Saddam's forces at this time. So, when it came for the 900,000 troops to move through, of which the British, Australians and Americans go in first, the war was already won. And Saddam's forces were pushed back and defeated within this 100 hours. Instead of 10,000 killed, there were just 154 American troops. So high technology was allowing the US to wage war in this low-cost, low-blood fashion. And it would quickly move through to bloodless wars, wars where there would be 0 fatalities for US and NATO troops. Now, for those who don't know the story behind the Kosovo campaign, in this particular conflict, after the genocides in Rwanda and Bosnia, the West took upon itself to react to the mounting tensions within Bosnia. President Milosevic had a policy, or so NATO said, of ethnic cleansing, and there were around 300,000 people who were on the move, native Kosovar Albanians. And once diplomatic options had failed in 1999, the US and its NATO allies started to deploy force from the air. Again, 0 or very minimal ground footprint, and a conflict that was defined by the use of drones and high-tech precision missiles. This conflict lasted a mere 78 days, and like I said, resulted in 0 fatalities. This over not through ethos, through high technology, was finally coming to fruition. It was described by the then Secretary of State as the most precise application of air power in history, and General Wesley Clark here, who was Supreme Allied Commander Europe at the time, came up with the evocative, potent imagery that couples walked along the Danube and dined at sidewalk cafes as the bombardment went on around them. That's how precise this conflict was. This was the future of American and Western warfare. What he doesn't mention there, of course, is that there were some mistakes made, like the bombing of the Chinese embassy. But, you know, that's the nature of war. Now, this is how warfare was always meant to be. And it was how it was meant to continue into the 21st century, and especially after 9/11. It was on October the 7th, 2001, that the first armed drone was used in anger by the United States. And it's no coincidence that this was just under a month after the devastating attacks on New York. Now, armed drones, importantly, were a step forward because they were the first time that the US had combined those pinpoint precision missiles and attached them actually to the drones themselves, creating one unit that allowed for the loitering and then imminent destruction of an enemy target. And this made them the perfect weapon to go and hunt down the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks after they happened in 2001. So they were sent to Afghanistan. They were sent down to hunt Mullah Omar, who was the head of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And the first drone strike that happened, again, on October 7th, was overseen by Dep Chula, who had been inspired early on by this ambition for high-tech, bloodless wars. I won't go into detail, but this first use was a bit of a failure. They found Mullah Omar with the drone, but they believed that he was hiding in a mosque, so they didn't want to blow it up, understandably. So instead, someone came up with the bright idea of blowing up a van outside to distract him, and then he'd run away, and then you could try and kill him as he ran. But there was lots of smoke that comes up when you blow up a giant van or lorry, so he was able to get away in the ensuing chaos. I don't think he was found for another 5, 6, 7 years after that point. But again, the potential was there. This new system allowed for America to face its terroristic foes on the other side of the world without having to deploy large amounts of troops. This was meant to be another Kosovo. And in fact, early on, it was. The air war started on October 7th, along with the drones, hitting Taliban and al-Qaeda targets. By November 14th, the Taliban and al-Qaeda are said to have been defeated. The UN passes Resolution 1378, and the calls begin for a peace-building mission within Afghanistan. This victory was rapid. It was dominated by air power alone. But of course, as we know, that's not how it transpired. The US and Western forces become distracted by Iraq. Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are not defeated. They merely move over into the porous borders in the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan. And then we get caught in the quagmire that is that costly, heavy ground conflict. But it's as a result of this cost-heavy conflict and the 2,500 US fatalities and 20,000 casualties that the search for new technological fixes once again begins. And here we are, back to Obama and his quest for bloodless war. The public support for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that were at 87%, by the time Obama came to power, they were at 53% as the war was going badly. Drones, like we said, were this quick fix. They were precise. I've added the brackets here because simply put, they save American lives. They remove risk from war. And what Obama did was he started to develop a strategy where you could use drones to hunt down terrorists. And then if you needed ground troops, you'd rely on your special forces, a smaller, lower number footprint that you could deploy on the ground, and they would be protected by the drones over the top. Force protection. And you'd also rely on proxy forces as well, mainly because you don't care as much if the troops of another nation or non-state actor are killed, but also as they know the region and they know the area. And special forces help train those. And most importantly, there was no terrorist threat from the air for these troops on the ground. The terrorists didn't have their own air power capacity to attack these troops. So it was really successful for the US, arguably, if you talk to Obama. And as Trump comes to power, in fact, there's far more continuity than change from those periods. Now, the end of these strikes being moral or ethical, proportionate, discriminate, just war have gone out of the window. Trump very much likes the idea that these are part of blowing the shit out of the enemy. I think that's his exact quote, to quote the President of the United States. He said, I would just just bomb those suckers, and that's right, I'd blow up the pipes, I'd blow up the refineries, I'd blow up every single inch, there would be nothing left. And he's even expanded the use of drones alongside special forces and proxy forces. So more than under Obama, more than under Bush, special forces with drone oversight are now deployed in Syria, Niger, Somali, Cameroon, Kenya, Libya, Mali, Mauritania, Egypt, and Tunisia. And Niger again, for good measure by the looks of it. But there's a problem. And this is that the drone landscape is rapidly changing. And this is where we come to my argument about the new epoch of Western warfare and a new drone age. Not only have 18 state actors and counting now got access to armed, weaponised drone technology, but anyone who has the ability to turn the off-the-shelf quadcopter that you can buy online from any large retailer and turn that into an airborne IED can now attack Western forces that are on the ground. So the capacity to cause terror, or at least mischief and trouble by drone, has spread rapidly. Rogue drones, like the case at Gatwick Airport over Christmas last year, something which delayed my flights as well, but it's not all about me. And through to the Japanese environmental terrorism case of 2015, now cause mayhem at international airports and sensitive government sites back here in Europe and with Western allies. To go into a brief bit of detail about the Japanese case, this was when a Japanese environmental activist took a drone that they bought online, tied a vessel of radioactive waste to the bottom of it that they got from Fukushima. They then flew that to the top of the Japanese Prime Minister's house, where it sat radiating for 2 weeks without anybody noticing. Now, it's at this point we started to wake up to some of the threats that could occur from this democratisation of air power capacity. Add to this the threat posed by terrorist drones, such as those utilised by ISIS and Houthi rebels, or remote control wielding assassins in Venezuela, and you can begin to see how the drone scene has changed. But what does this mean for future war? Well, let me start with a quote by General Raymond Thomas, who is the commander of US Special Operations Command. And this is a recent quote where he said that about 5 or 6 months ago, when they were deployed in Iraq, the effort there nearly came to a screeching halt when literally over a 24-hour period, 70 ISIS drones appeared in the air above them. And this isn't an isolated event. The terrorist drones and tactics evolved at a rapid pace in Syria and Iraq between 2015 up until most recently. They started as surveillance to help the terrorists pinpoint their snipers or to direct their vehicle-borne IEDs into coalition and American special forces. But they quickly turned into drones which could drop improvised bombs onto the enemy. They were able to release 40mm grenades from the drones high above with almost perfect precision via remote control from over 3 kilometres away. And from my interviews, this had a massive effect on the effectiveness and the ability of Western coalition and proxy forces to move forward and fight on the ground. They were able to suppress the enemy very effectively because we didn't have the counter-technologies to fight these. And I would argue that we still don't have effective counter-technologies to protect the deployment of Western forces on the ground. And if we do have some counter-technologies, then they're not ready for the next stage, which we're already starting to see, which is terrorists deploying swarms of drones, not just in ones or twos, but swarms of drones against targets. So Russia had 13 to 24 drones, they're a bit secretive about it, deployed by a terroristic actor against their bases. They say that they shut them all off and destroyed them, it was fine. But they're lying, because we've seen other reports that say the drones got through and were able to penetrate these bases and cause some quite substantial damage. So here's where I'll leave it. In an ironic twist, the technologies that were once used to ensure zero combat fatalities for the West have now become a major threat in those conflicts against those same terroristic enemies and insurgents. The technologies of bloodless warfare are creating the rise of a new period of blooded warfare for Western nations. I was going to talk about eagles, which we're trying to train to take down drones, which is bizarre in itself. But these are just some of the questions that I'm currently working on in my work as a means to try and judge just how this will impact the West's ability to meet national security threats around the globe, both now and into the future. Thank you very much.